Good morning. If we could please take our seats. Again, my name is Stephen Long, and for those of you just arriving, it's my pleasure to welcome you here to the Providence College Veritas Conference. It's also my pleasure to welcome Ken Myers as our second keynote speaker. Since 1993, Ken Myers has served as host and producer of the Mars Hill Audio Journal. Incidentally, by my count, that means that Ken had the title Mars Hill Audio long before you may be aware there's a evangelical megachurch that rose and spectacularly flamed out on the West Coast called Mars Hill. No relation whatsoever. I get that question rather regularly. Ken had the title first. So Ken is formerly the editor of This World, a journal of religion and public life, an executive editor of Eternity, an evangelical monthly magazine. His career began as a producer and editor for National Public Radio, working for much of that time as arts and humanities editor for the morning edition. You'll notice that he has a very NPR-esque voice, pleasant to listen to. So I recommend that you check out the website for the audio journal. It's marshillaudio.org. It's one of the best resources I know for finding what the interesting books are and having interesting conversations about what's out. So I highly recommend that, and I look forward to hearing him speak to us today. So please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here. Since we just heard two podcasters, I often lament the fact that having invented the idea of an audio periodical in 1993, I didn't patent the idea because I'd be really rich now. And I will mention briefly, we've been selling audio since 1993, but when digital audio distribution became a possibility, we realized we had to give some away. It's kind of like a drug dealer. We'll give some away and then get people to pay for it later. So we have an app, and we distribute once a week what we call a Friday feature, which is free audio, some of it recycled from interviews I've done over the years, some of it new material. And yesterday, because of this conference, we released an interview I did about 5 years ago with Kevin Vost, who wrote a book called The Four Friendships, From Aristotle to Aquinas. So if you're not familiar with Mars Hill Audio, that might be a good way to, it's only available via our app, which is available on Android and Apple. Let me also mention the title of the talk. Of course, when you're invited to give a talk, you're asked for a title and description before you've written the talk. And I had a rough idea what I might want to talk about. But as I've thought about it more, I realized I wanted to add something about hope to material I'd been working through. And so I'm going to prepend my remarks with some biblical passages that correlate, I think, our understanding of friendship and hope. I also will mention first, I'm going to cite a lot of works by Oliver O'Donovan, and I know O'Donovan's not that well known, even among people who really should know his work. He was a professor of Regius Professor of Moral Philosophy at Oxford for many years. He finished his career at Edinburgh. He's now retired, but I'll be citing, and I won't footnote all the citations. There's a chapter in his book called Ways of Judgment that I'll be citing, and also the later books he wrote. He wrote 3 volumes, relatively small but dense volumes, under the title Ethics as Theology, and it's in the 3rd of those volumes called Entering into Rest, in which he deals with the question of friendship extensively. But the shape of his work is very helpful, I think, in understanding friendship. So the title of the event is taken from a statement that Jesus made on the night in which he was betrayed, a passage that we've recently liturgically experienced. And during Holy Week in the lectionary that our Anglican tradition uses, we read the entire upper room discourse from John 13 through 17. And that's where this happens. And it's a passage that contains the most extended teaching of Jesus in the entire New Testament. And the theme of friendship comes up more than once. And it's also a passage in which the coming of the Holy Spirit is promised, which is this remarkable expression of hope. And so I want to look at, very quickly, some of those passages. In the 13th chapter of the Gospel, Jesus says, "A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another, just as I have loved you. You also are to love one another. By this all people will know that you are my disciples, that you have love for one another." And then in chapter 14, Jesus promises the Spirit. But before he promises this comforter or helper that will come, he says, "If you love me," he brings back the idea of love. "If you love me, you will keep my commandments. And I will ask the Father, and he will give you another helper to be with you forever, even the Spirit of truth, whom the world cannot receive because it neither sees him nor knows him." And then a bit later, he reintroduces this idea of the relationship between love and obedience. "Whoever has my commandments and keeps them, he it is who loves me, and he who loves me will be loved by my Father, and I will love him and manifest myself to him." Judas, not Iscariot, said, "Lord, how is it that you will manifest yourself to us and not to the world?" And Jesus answers, "If anyone loves me, he will keep my word, and my Father will love him, and we will come to him and make our home with him," which suggests that it's in that love that the manifestation of Jesus is present. And then in chapter 15, Jesus presents this long extended metaphor that describes the mystical means whereby spiritual fruitfulness is achieved. That Jesus is the true vine, the Father is the vine dresser, and the branches that don't bear fruit are taken away. Branches that bear fruit, he prunes that it may bear more fruit. "I'm the vine, you are the branches," he says to the disciples. "Whoever abides in me and I in him, he it is that bears much fruit. If you abide in me and my words abide in you, ask whatever you wish and it will be done for you." And then, "As the Father has loved me, so have I loved you. Abide in my love. If you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love, just as I've kept my Father's commandments. This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you." And then the phrase from which the title is taken, "Greater love has no one than this, that someone lay down his life for his friends. You are my friends if you do what I command you." That's a little bit of a shocking conditionality there. And I want to address that a little bit later. "No longer do I call you servants, for the servant does not know what his master is doing, but I've called you friends." I think the emphasis on obedience in this passage really should be understood in light of what Jesus says right before the ascension, where he says, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to him," and he tells his followers to make disciples in all the world, teaching the new disciples to obey everything that he commanded. So I think in light of what Jesus says on that Thursday, I think we can say that making disciples is a process of extending the friendship of Jesus. And I think we need to recall that the conditionality that's expressed there reminds us that obedience to Jesus isn't a matter of rule following, of something arbitrary or imposed, but it's actually a matter of living in accordance with, in harmony with, in tune with the order of beauty, truth, and goodness that proceeds from the life of God into creation. The messianic hope that permeates the Old Testament is a longing for that harmony to be fulfilled. And it's clearly evident in the canticles in the Gospel of Luke from the Virgin Mary, from Zechariah, and from Simeon, each of whom praises God for the accomplishment, the fulfillment of this promised Messiah, which was a promised restoration of order in creation. Christian hope is necessarily eschatological. Oliver O'Donovan has written that hope acquires its assurance with the word, "The time is fulfilled and the kingdom of God has drawn near." It's the certainty of the coming of the kingdom, a certainty confirmed by the resurrection, and then by the Pentecost that Jesus promised on that night. That's the ground and the substance of our hope. O'Donovan has also written that the risen life of the last Adam gives hope to the first Adam in the midst of God's created work. The risen life of the last Adam inaugurates the Creator's purpose to consummate all life, past, present, and future, in the reign of life, R-E-I-G-N, by the way. In the empty tomb, we're shown heaven and earth where promise that they shall be restored, not destroyed and brought to nothing. And we're taught to look for new activity, new deeds, new possibilities that prepare the way for a new heaven and a new earth. The eschatological hope that's secured by the resurrection doesn't mean that we sit around and wait for the second coming. Rather, it means that we act now in participating in the redemptive work, the presence of Christ in the Holy Spirit, the work that was promised in that astonishing Thursday night before Calvary. In his letter to the Ephesians, a passage in the first chapter that I think is unfortunately neglected in a lot of Christian reflection now on the meaning of redemption, Paul says that God's purpose set forth in Christ as a plan for the fullness of time has been to unite all things in him, things in heaven and on earth. And that unity is expressed by true friendship. True friendship is a subset or a case in point of a cosmic unity, a comprehensive harmony. Now, the subject of friendship isn't one I've devoted a lot of sustained reflection to, but some of the fundamental themes that are related to friendship have interested me for a long time. Given the work that I do as a professional communicator, as someone who lives by having conversations, I've thought a lot about the nature of conversation and about communication more generally. I remember when I first read it was an essay by Joseph Pieper, and I'm blanking on the title of it now, where he said, "Truth lives in human conversation." I had thought truth lived in books, which is why I have thousands of them in my house. But lo and behold, truth lives in human conversation. I was actually gratified to learn that, though, because I've been having conversations and recording and sharing them with people for decades. Conversation and communication are obviously key components of friendship, or maybe it might be better to say that friendship is a fundamental form of communication. That word communication is richer than we sometimes realize. I often tell people that my undergraduate degree was in communications. I had an emphasis on film theory and criticism. The department I was in at the University of Maryland when I graduated in the early 1970s, the department was designated the Department of Speech and Dramatic Arts. It's now known as the Department of Communication. I was curious to find out the history. It's a department that had been rechristened numerous times. In 1901, the department was originally born as the Department of Public Speaking. And for 6 years, right before World War I, it was identified as the Department of Oratory. I don't think there's a Department of Oratory anywhere in American higher education right now. But when I graduated in 1974, my department was offering specialized degrees in rhetoric, in speech therapy, and in drama, as well as in broadcast and film studies. So kind of a broad understanding of communication. And the courses I took included courses in the art of listening. I got 3 credits for learning about listening. And I've come to appreciate the fact that I think public life would be better served if more attention was given to listening rather than talking. The idea of communication is a capacious one. It has obviously a theological as well as a rhetorical register. As Trinitarians, we affirm the reality of communication within the Godhead, the most obvious example being the fact that the Son prays to the Father. And as image bearers, we echo the relationality of God. Human communities are expressions of communication. And so communication is a central aspect of community. And hence, a concern of politics properly understood. When the ideas of communication and politics are juxtaposed, people might assume that what's suggested concerns public discourse or public relations, or maybe even propaganda and fake news. But politics is not just a matter of the conduct or practice of governing. Politics is a matter of the formation and sustaining of political communities that governments are tasked to serve and protect. Politics is first about communities, about societies, and then about government. And the well-being of communities is sustained by various modes of communication that promote common concerns. Friendship is one of those modes, and in pre-modern societies, friendship was understood to be a significant aspect of political life. I'll state parenthetically here that the modern exaltation of the state over society has identified politics more as the science of governing, of securing, maintaining, and exercising power, and maybe exercising power without even paying much attention to the task of governing. And in the process, modern political thought has reduced the scope and significance of friendship. In 1 Corinthians, St. Paul uses the Greek word koinonia in 2 different senses. In chapter 10, verse 6, speaking of the bread and cup in the Eucharist, koinonia has a verbal sense of sharing or communion or participation. But earlier in the letter, in chapter 1, verse 9, St. Paul writes that his readers were called into the koinonia of God's Son, Jesus Christ our Lord. And here, koinonia is not the act of participation or communication or sharing. It has the sense of fellowship or community. And when that Greek word was translated into Latin in the Western Church, it was rendered both as communicatio and communitas. Oliver O'Donovan has observed, quote, those who are partners to communication, koinonia in the verbal sense, form a community, koinonia in the concrete sense. A community is a sphere in which things are communicated, and they are held in common rather than in private. They are ours rather than merely yours or mine. We tend to think of communication as a process that involves ideas, the sort of process studied in a department of oratory or public speaking, but in its larger sense, we can speak of any kind of good, material or spiritual, as something that's communicated. Even diseases are communicated, right? Communicable diseases. In the city of God, Augustine observes, a people, we may say, is a gathered multitude of rational beings united by agreeing to share the things they love. There can be as many different kinds of people as there are different things for them to love. Whatever those things may be, there is no absurdity in calling it a people if it is a gathered multitude, not of beasts, but of rational creatures united by agreeing to share what they love. The better the things, the better the people. The worse the things, the worse their agreement to share them. So a people constituted by common objects of love is, as O'Donovan puts it, quote, capable of common action, susceptible to common suffering, participating in a common identity, close quote. Members of a people can speak as a we, not just an I. members of a community may love one another, but that, in a sense, is a second step. It's a consequence of a shared love of something other than the members themselves. Political scientist John von Haking notes, quote, "Our love of common objects transforms into love of each other as our habits and predispositions intermingle to the point where we cannot conceive of those common objects of love independently of those that we share them with." And so communities understood in this way are, in a sense, friendships writ large. Friendships are also grounded in common loves. In his book, The Four Loves, C.S. Lewis famously distinguished lovers from friends by observing, quote, "Lovers are always talking to one another about their love. Friends hardly ever about their friendship. Lovers are normally face-to-face, absorbed in each other. Friends, side by side, absorbed in some common interest. Two friends delight to be joined by a third, and three by a fourth." And there Lewis quotes the blessed souls who are depicted by Dante as they exclaim, "Here comes one who will augment our loves." Friendship is thus an analog of the heavenly community in which the multitude of the blessed, and this is, again, Lewis's phrase, increases the fruition which each has in God. Friendship, then, is an analog of the church, ordered by love and gifted to one another by what Augustine calls a kind of divine lottery. All true human communities are imperfect, incomplete, but nonetheless real anticipations of the church's life and its fulfillment. The perfected koinonia, that is the final identity of the church, is the end for which all human beings were created. Now, I think we learned something about the relationship between friendship and hope by reflecting on the way in which St. Paul presents the three theological virtues, faith, hope, and love. And this is something, the reason O'Donovan appears so much in my comments, this is something I've learned from him. I didn't realize until it was reading the first volume in this series, Ethics as Theology, that the order in which the virtues are presented in 1 Corinthians 13, the common order of faith, hope, and love, is unique in St. Paul's writings. Normally, it's faith, love, and hope. And O'Donovan has a chapter in the third of those volumes called The Sovereignty of Love, which may be a phrase from Augustine, in which he asks, why does Paul invert the order in that chapter? The sequence in which faith is followed by love, and then love is followed by hope, to say faith, love, and hope. O'Donovan says this demonstrates that our Christian experience results in action, because hope is something that activates us. O'Donovan believes that Paul, in speaking much more frequently of faith, love, and hope, that Paul sees this rhythm as representing the shape of the Christian life. Baptism, church membership, love within the community, and endurance. O'Donovan writes, the significance of the order is chronological. The Christian life begins with faith and continues with participation in the community, which is love. When a third member is added, hope, it extends the Christian life into continuing witness, especially in the face of persecution. The phrase faith, love, and endurance is found in New Testament texts, and in 4 places that phrase shows up. Faith, love, and sanctification is found in 1 Timothy 2, and faith, love, and sanctity is found in 1 Timothy 4. O'Donovan believes that when St. Paul uses hope as the third member of this triad, that it signals an attitude toward the passing of time. And it's only in the 1 Corinthians 13 text that love is made preeminent. The preeminence of love, O'Donovan argues, points to the fact that that our crowning action and finally our end is in community. Love gives us hope, but the perseverance generated by hope is perseverance in the service of the fulfillment of love. And here I'll quote him exactly. When love is taken from its median position and relocated at the summit of the triad, it's a statement about the finality of community. But it's also a statement about the end of time, for love is now placed at the far side of hope, the virtue that anchors the endurance of time in a future of promise. Now, the classical pre-Christian understanding of friendship lacked this eschatological dimension, but it did lay the foundation for much later Christian reflection on the significance of friendship in the formation of community and particularly of virtuous citizenship. In an essay on Aristotle's view of how friendship encourages the growth of moral excellence, philosopher Robert Sokolovsky provides a very helpful summary of how friendships form, according to Aristotle. Quote, "We first act with others in regard to more mundane, ordinary tasks. We work with someone in an office or factory. We play golf with someone." Golf wasn't one of Aristotle's examples. That's it took the Scots to invent a sport with so much work for so little payoff. We play golf with someone, we attend classes together. Such friendships may be useful and pleasant, and as such they are more under our control. Then gradually we realize that we and the other person can deal not only with such superficial things, but that we begin to face life together. We begin to cope with the deeper contingencies and situations that arise in life. We begin to deal with the kinds of things that our moral virtues, our courage, temperance, generosity, justice, are concerned with. We find that we can deliberate and choose with the other person in regard to the obligations, difficulties, and projects that define us as human beings, and not just as employees or consumers. A hand-in-glove cooperation becomes possible that can arise for us with only a few people in a lifetime. The kind of reciprocal trust, disclosure, and benevolence that constitutes a noble friendship gradually takes shape, close quote. Aristotle argued that friends that were so bonded could assist each other to gain self-knowledge and thus to become both intellectually and morally virtuous. Like Plato, Aristotle argued that this process of stimulating intellectual and moral virtues primarily takes the form of conversation, of speaking with one another, of communication. Political philosopher John von Haking writes that, quote, "This vision of friendship informs Aristotle's understanding of politics. The aim of politics is living well in a polity governed by justice, which justice is practiced by citizens in proheretic," and I hope I'm pronouncing it, that means virtue-forming, friendship. Friendship and politics are mutually dependent in Aristotle, close quote. Life in the larger community requires virtuous citizens whose affections have been trained to love the good within friendships. And the polity was committed for protecting space within the network of social institutions in which such friendships could thrive. In my text here, I have a footnote recommending, and this was the essay in which Joseph Pieper talks about communication, truth living in conversation. It's abuse of language, abuse of power. And I had a note in here because I wanted to mention it. He has a wonderful discussion of the dangers of speech that is uttered for the sake of obtaining power, of influencing, rather than for orienting us properly to reality. The essay is essentially an analysis of Plato's critique of the sophists, of flattery, and much of what Pieper discusses concerns protecting the health of conversation so that friendly conversation actually is virtue-inducing. He writes, "Word and language form the medium that sustains the common existence of the human spirit. As such, the reality of the word in eminent ways makes existential interaction happen. And so, if the word becomes corrupted, human existence itself will not remain unaffected and untainted. That's abuse of language, abuse of power by Pieper. So the well-being of communities, no less than the vitality of friendships, depends on healthy, honest, non-manipulative language. Unfortunately, the rhetorical landscape we live in today does little to instruct us in the use of language that nurtures perception of the truth of things, including the truth of ourselves, and so our relationships are less likely, all other things being equal, to be the schools of virtue that they could be. Robert Sokolovsky nicely summarizes Aristotle's insight into the way that friendships can become schools of virtue, an insight that's developed later by Augustine and Aquinas. Sokolovsky writes, quote, "Perfect friendship, friendship of the highest kind, requires that each of the friends wishes and performs the good of the other friend. He wills the good of his friend. That is, he takes the good of the friend as his own good. When I act with and for a friend, I act in such a way that what is good for the friend, as such, is wished for and done as my own good. His good, as good for him, has become my good, and he acts in the same manner toward me. The good each of us seeks is not just our own individual good, but the good in common and the good for the other. If my friend and I are accomplishing something as friends, I'm not just trying to do something that benefits me, I'm trying to do something that benefits him as well, and I do it precisely as benefiting him. It's being good for him has become good for me. I have enlarged my sense of what is good for me. I wish not only things that benefit me individually, but also things that benefit others, my friends, and I wish those things precisely as benefiting them. This expansion of my desire for the good, this intersubjectivizing of the good by me, means that I have become more virtuous, more human, more perfect as an agent," close quote. So Aristotle, and of course Aristotle assumed that the good was an objective reality. What is good for my friend isn't just merely a subjective preference of his or of mine or of our little group. Just as the common good for a community does not consist in maximizing the capacity for each individual to pursue their own idiosyncratic understanding of what's good for them. For Aristotle, what is good for my friend is a particularized expression of the transcendent good. Now, when Christian thinkers took up the idea of friendship and the relationship of these schools of virtue to the life of political communities, they enlarged the scope and consequences of such shared life in light of the eschatological promise in the church, the city of God. O'Donovan comments, quote, "Christian moral reason differed from antique moral reason in understanding community not just as the context for practical satisfaction, but as the essential content of it. It achieved its overcoming of the polis, of the pagan polis, in other words, not by elevating the individual subject over the community, but by accepting community in a commanding position among the moral purposes of agency, a change made possible by the refoundation of community in Christ," close quote. In other words, the life of the church wasn't simply the setting for moral growth, it was recognized as the goal of moral growth, building up the life of the body of Christ. Becoming perfected together, united by one Lord in one faith and one hope as the bride of Christ together, this is the good toward which all other goods aim. And so, in the Christian account, friendship and politics were both elevated and paradoxically diminished. Diminished because they're mere hints of the greatest good that is to come, but elevated because, as was true for John the Baptist, even to be the herald of something so glorious is an awesomely high calling. And so Aquinas could say, among all worldly things, there is nothing which seems worthy to be preferred to friendship. Now, if Aquinas could say it, why didn't modern political philosophers say it? Why has modern political philosophy, until relatively recently, tended to ignore friendship? In The Four Loves, early in that chapter on friendship, C.S. Lewis observes that in modern society, friendship has come to be regarded, quote, as something quite marginal. Not a main course in life's banquet, a diversion, something that fills up the chinks of one's time. The other two of the first three loves that Lewis discusses, affection and eros, still get a lot of recognition and attention, but Lewis believed that, quote, very few modern people think friendship a love of comparable value to affection or eros, or even a love at all. To the ancients, friendship seemed the happiest and most fully human of all loves, the crown of life and the school of virtue. The modern world, in comparison, ignores it. We admit, of course, that besides a wife and family, a man needs a few friends, but the very tone of the admission and the sort of acquaintanceships with which those who make it would describe as friendships show clearly that they're talking about what what they are talking about has very little to do with what philia is in Aristotle's classification among the virtues, or that amicitia, on which Cicero wrote a book. Lewis then goes on to speculate about why friendship had been demoted or trivialized in modern societies. His first suggestion is that few people experience real friendship, and so few people value it. And furthermore, he says, we can live without friendship. Quote, without eros, none of us would have been begotten, and without affection, none of us would have been reared. But we can live and breed without friendship. Now, friendship is thus, in a sense, Lewis surmised, doesn't seem to be as natural as eros or affection. Most modern people assume that the most significant aspects of human life are those which, as Lewis phrases it, can produce certificates of an animal origin or of survival value, and friendship can't be so certified, and so it's probably not fundamental to human being. Lewis also observes that there are collectivist tendencies in modern society which disparage friendship, since in friendship, true individuality, but not individualism, is highly valued. And so, he writes, quote, some forms of democratic sentiment are naturally hostile to it because it is selective and an affair of the few, close quote. Friendship seems elitist or exclusive in an age of egalitarian inclusiveness. And then Lewis claims that friendship is treated with such dismissive or suspicious prejudice in modern culture. Because it's treated that way, many people assume, quote, that every firm and serious friendship is really homosexual, a form of eros not recognized. As Lewis writes, modern people can't imagine an intense and intimate love between two men or between two women that doesn't reveal or conceal a fundamentally sexual attraction. And he spends several pages deconstructing that claim. It might be interesting reading for some of you. Now, when I reread this book several years ago, I was surprised that although Lewis commented on the modern trivialization of friendship, he didn't mention at all what I think is the most remarkable aspect of that trivialization, the near complete ignoring of friendship in modern political theory. He does mention Aristotle and Cicero as champions of the virtue of friendship, but he neglects to mention that in both instances, and in antiquity generally, friendship was regarded as a public more than a private matter. In a 2008 anthology called Friendship and Politics, John von Haking says that, quote, throughout the greater part of the history of political philosophy, friendship has occupied a central part in the conversation. If we draw on conventional historical distinctions, friendship perennially figured as the sine qua non of discussions among ancient and medieval political thinkers regarding good political order and the good human life, close quote. In a 1978 book called Politics as Friendship, Horst Huther provides evidence that, quote, Western political speculation finds its origin in a system of thought in which the idea of friendship is the major principle in terms of which political theory and practice are described, explained, and analyzed. And another scholar who's commented on this in an essay on the place of friendship in the political theology of the Reformers, Thomas Heilke, who until recently was a professor of political science at the University of Kansas, exclaims that in the ancient world, long before Aristotle formalized a theory of friendship, Friendship was universally portrayed as a vital part of civic life, and therefore a central concern when reflecting on the dynamics of human life together. He concludes, quote, "There is no instance in any treatment of the story of friendship in a purely private matter. None, period. In all cases, from the myth of Gilgamesh to the epics of Homer, through the poems of Theognis, I did 6th century BC, I had to look that up in Wikipedia, to the tragedies of Sophocles and all points between, friendship always has public political connotations and implications." And finally, Hans Georg Gadamer, more recent, not that recent, I guess, I can't remember when he made this quip, that Aristotle deals with justice in a single book, but friendship fills 2 books in the Ethics. Friendship receives no more than a single page's discussion in Kant. Lewis was right to see a general neglect of friendship in modern thinking, and reading the friendship chapter in The Four Loves certainly conveys how this neglect has unfortunate consequences for personal life, but the consequences of this neglect within modern politics is not adequately recognized. One of the principal factors in the decline of importance given to friendship acknowledged by Lewis is that modern political and social theory banished friendship to private precincts where it could have no public significance. The modern understanding of what a society is and what the aims of political authority are, indeed the modern understanding of what human persons are imagined to be, no longer requires the capacities that are nurtured by friendship. In the best pre-modern thought about politics, there was no wall of separation between public and private, between material and spiritual, between politics and the virtues. The virtues and vices of persons were not assumed to be their own business and of no public consequence. Political communities were bodies, and the health of the body was tied to the health of its members. The integral and intrinsic relationship between what we think of as public and private was not, first of all, a political theory. It was a metaphysical and philosophical assumption about the nature of reality. And here I want to recommend a book that I only recently, I met this author years ago, but knew about this book, but only recently read it. It's called Friendship as Sacred Knowing, Samuel Kimbriel, K-I-M-B-R-I-E-L. And the subtitle is Overcoming Isolation. And in his book, he engages Charles Taylor's work, particularly his analysis of how modern imaginations are cut off from recognition of a transcendent order. We live in this immanent frame. In Taylor's term. And Kimbriel summarizes themes in Taylor's books, both Sources of the Self and A Secular Age, and focuses on the attention that Taylor gives to the fact that this detachment from the transcendent is not just a result of different thinking about ethics or morality or personality. It's a new understanding of the nature of knowledge that emerges particularly in the 17th century, and Kimbriel focuses on Descartes' influence. Descartes championing the view that reliable knowledge had to be detached, neutral, indifferent, impersonal, disengaged. If we wanted to know things, really know things, we had to set aside our prejudices. We had to set aside our affections. We had to set aside our hopes. We had to set aside personality. AI is the best way of knowing, I guess. So human beings were configured in Descartes more as kind of algorithmic engines than as human knowers, personal knowers. So if we really want to understand things, we have to be totally disinterested, which was a radical departure from what had been assumed from forever. It was always assumed that, and here I want to quote Kimbriel's summary of this, the pre-modern stance is defined by a metaphysics and practical economy of participation, by enmeshment in every sphere, from the ground of being itself to civic life to rationality. We were engaged. It's a model of engaged knowing. The question in this pre-modern world was never whether one should or shouldn't be involved, but rather how to be involved rightly. How might one learn to move beyond the domination of the obsessive love of transient things, to rise up through this love to love and know the eternal? When the philosopher strove to be rational, this was precisely what was sought. This was what it meant to be rational. And I'm reminded here of the arguments that C.S. Lewis makes in The Abolition of Man. Thus, the term philosopher was very apt. Well, philosopher etymologically meaning a lover of wisdom. For to be a philosopher was to be engaged in the task of loving, indeed of befriending, that which deserves to be loved, wisdom itself. To take oneself to be uninvolved would have been thought absurd. Now, Kimbrell points out that modern thinkers such as Descartes advanced the ideal of detached knowing because they believed it provided tools for more control over things. I just remembered a comment I've heard and read that actually the comment I heard was from a fellow I know very well when email first emerged as a way of communicating. He was a research scientist at a major psychopharmacology lab, and he said, I really like email because it means you can engage with people without having to treat them as persons. That and a number of researchers have talked about how people who prefer, it's not uncommon, I'm told, to be in a room like a cafeteria at a high school or college and to see people texting each other like across the table. that texting is a mode that gives more control. I've also been told that younger people who've grown up in this communication ecosystem don't like the lack of control that a telephone conversation, actually talking with, or let alone a face-to-face conversation. Face-to-face conversation, you don't have control over the pregnant pauses or the stammering or the inconveniences of it. And so our technologies are designed to give us more control. And so this modern ideal of control, as Taylor summarizes, that Descartes' concern for control, and you can see it in Bacon in a slightly different way, in order to pursue knowledge that is power, it has to be a detached mode of knowledge. Now, Kimbrell, in his book, he focuses most of his attention on recognizing the effects of this view of knowing on friendship. How does this social ecosystem in which we live affect the intuitions that people have about being vulnerable and being engaged? And particularly, again, the title of his book is Friendship as Sacred Knowing. The severing of knowing, of engaging the world intellectually, in the fullest sense of that word, and relationships. He believes that those two things have been severed. He writes, as the deep contours of the world are taken to be available only to disengaged reflection, the split between friendship and knowledge is exacerbated, for now the longings of friendship can no longer be seen as sharing in a broader reality. Remember Lewis's idea that friends are looking out to the world and they're looking hopefully and with energy, and they are engaged in the life of the world together. They're sharing a life in the world together. Well, if the world is understood in a disengaged way, that, Kimbrell argues, that pattern of disengagement in the nature of knowledge makes friendship, well, first of all, he argues it makes it more intensely valued, but it's also intensely privatized and sentimentalized. In a climate, as he writes, thus evacuated of love as a serious public reality, the longing for friendship can be interpreted as nothing but sentimental, privatized affection directed toward individual fulfillment. And later he writes that the modern rejecting of the logic of cosmic attunement, and that's a theme he deals with earlier on, that the philosopher wanted to be in tune with the world. The philosopher wanted to be properly enmeshed and in sync with the world. That gets back to what I claimed Jesus' demands for obedience. Demands for obedience are basically a demand to be in harmony with the order that God has established. When the modern rejecting of the logic of cosmic attuning, which is the effort to perceive and love the order that God has placed in creation and to tune one's own inner life to that order, that logic has been resituated, as Kimbriel writes, quote, by reconstructing the impulses toward attunement felt in friendship in an immanent fashion, that is, without reference to anything transcendent. But this is just what friendship cannot be, for no two individuals can sustain their practice on their own. If friendship is to be a coherent practice at all, it is a practice defined by the sharing of both friends in a broader reality that envelops and informs both. If there's no objective order which is celebrated and honored within friendships, no good, true, beautiful, holy, just, and wonderful pattern of reality that friends can rejoice in together, then their relationship becomes arbitrary and self-serving and ultimately morally unintelligible. Now, I think it's important to remember then that the disorder of modern political thought reflects confusion about metaphysics, not just about morals or sociology or human psychology. Modern politics claims to separate the public from the private, envisioning government as a neutral, amoral machine that impersonally directs shared life in a way that maximizes the freedom of individuals to live however they want to. But that's in part because modern thought assumed that creation is a neutral, amoral, impersonal machine, and that there's no good reason to give preference to any particular understanding of the good, except maybe preference should be given to those projects that are most thoroughly transgressive. Since the seriously transgressive are more consistent in rejecting the view that the givenness of reality establishes definition for our lives, for lives that are good and true and beautiful. In other words, the radically transgressive repudiate the claim that love and obedience are intrinsically intertwined. Public life in liberal societies is supposed to be insulated. Public life in liberal societies is supposed to be insulated from the concerns of private life, but the barrier between them establishes a one-way blockage. The understanding of human nature and freedom that is presupposed in public life doesn't remain restricted in the public sphere, and it has come to inform the imaginations of many in their private lives. Liberalism doesn't just marginalize friendship, claiming indifference to its virtues and resources. Liberalism reconfigures friendship. Indeed, it redefines the logic of all relationships, making them in its own image. And so the Supreme Court's redefinition of marriage was simply the most dramatic instance of this kind of totalizing project. The loss of concern for friendship in modern thinking about politics, about the ordering of public life, is an important diagnostic symptom of the sources of social and political confusion that are increasingly evident not only in the US but in the modern West in general. Oliver O'Donovan has commented that the crisis of modern politics, which produces numerous angry backlash movements, is often described as an expression of anger on the part of people who feel excluded. But in fact, it's an expression of a deeper discontent, of a sense that modern politics has come to be perceived as morally unintelligible. Citizens perceive at some level that political institutions, in their fundamental configuration, are not doing justice to their humanity. But most citizens lack an adequate, well-articulated description of their humanity and how their humanity is part of a cosmic order. And hence they have difficulty recognizing the true and systemic failure of modern politics, because we're trained to to think in individualistic terms, we lack a vocabulary to express how politics has become corrupted by loss of vision for the good of communities in an ordered cosmos. I'm reminded here of a quip in Alasdair MacIntyre's After Virtue. MacIntyre points out that modern political communities have eliminated the possibility of being, quote, a shared understanding both of the good for man and of the good of the community, and the good of that community in which individuals identify their primary interests with reference to those goods. And as a result, and this was, 1984, MacIntyre wrote After Virtue. Modern politics, he writes, cannot be a matter of genuine moral consensus. Modern politics is civil war carried on by other means. I realize I'm running a little longer here. It's what happens when you pre-pen to talk, you carefully construct it. I will jump ahead here. We human beings are not best understood as bearers of rights, as sovereign choosers whose freedom requires an expansion of choices. We're rather grateful recipients whose freedom is ordered and actuated by love, and we're created for love. We're created for being known and knowing in relationship, in imitation of the love exchange within the Trinity. In conclusion, say my interest in Christian political theology, and I've been influenced a lot by O'Donovan's book, The Desire of the Nations, which is his major work on political theology. It's relatively new and was energized significantly as we lived particularly through the surreal election year of 2016. And I began asking myself, is what we're living through a sign of the failure of our political structures, or is it the logical outcome of a system with critical design flaws? And I've come to believe that a more hopeful future requires the radical revision of some basic beliefs about public life, about the relationship between state and society, and about how the ordering of temporal affairs should account for the full reality of what we are as human persons. And a number of thinkers more experienced and wiser than I have suggested that we have a very hard time imagining radically different paradigms for political life. And I think that we need to jumpstart our imaginations in a renewed understanding of and practice of friendship. John Milbank has noted, quote, the main reality of all human association, including political association, is to do with friendship, as both Plato and Aristotle taught. It is to do with benevolent generosity, as they taught in common with Confucius in the Far East. It is to do with a reciprocal sharing of all that is good. Only secondarily is it about organizing the distribution of material goods and about designing laws which are always somewhat arbitrary, yet should reflect as far as possible non-arbitrary justice. So, if Western societies are to recover the possibility of ordering public life around a common understanding of the good, of being real communities that ontologically are only intelligible because they anticipate a heavenly community, I think it can only happen as friendships are formed and flourish, friendships that bear witness to the priority and ultimacy of love in human life. Thanks very much.
We have time for some questions. I see a hand back here in the back, or was that just, I think I was hallucinating, sorry.
Thank you. I really enjoyed that. So maybe just two quick stories, and then I have a question. So I befriended in my PhD in the U.S. He became my best friend, a guy from Egypt. And in Egypt, you can call your friend, male friend, Habibi, which means like my love.
Yeah.
It's a very intimate language.
Yeah.
And the same thing in South Africa as well. You see a lot of the black African men walking down the street holding hands. You know, so there's this intimacy of language, which is sort of a bit taboo for us. And then the other one, I remember I was smoking shisha with with my friend Murad and then 2 guys from Pakistan. And at some point, the guy, I'd never just met him. First time, he put his hand over and started playing with my hair. And I wasn't sure what to do, but I was told by the other guy later on. He said, "No, this just meant that he was comfortable with you." Yeah, I was like, "Okay." I mean, anyways, those are just
Wasn't
stories.
necessarily a reciprocal.
Yeah, it's like, okay, but here's the question. Maybe I'm just wondering about friendship and the way we think about time and work, because my sense of this, the difficulty is, I just feel like we just don't have time or energy.
Yeah.
You know, it's like everyone's working so damn hard.
Right.
And so and then time becomes a matter of I need to be alone and relax. You know,
Right.
so there's something about how we work and with time, and how we think about friendship. Anyways,
Yeah. No, that's very good, and I think that's tied to this notion of knowledge as power too, because the Western exaltation of efficiency is a result of centuries of thinking that time is money. Okay, if knowledge is power, time is money, and it'd be interesting. And all the metaphors like time is money or wasting time. It'd be interesting to look at non-Western cultures and see, like the African or Egyptian culture, and see if there are anything comparable to that, possibly. But that mentality, I think, I can't remember who it was, might have been Presbyterian pastor Eugene Peterson, who talked about the obsession with efficiency. He says, I can't even treat my dog efficiently, or shouldn't, let alone maintain friendships. I think that was actually in a context where he was discussing Protestant worship services where they had a countdown clock. He was actually told he was going to preach somewhere, and he was told he had like 18 minutes for the sermon. And I've actually preached in a service once where there was a big digital clock telling me how much longer I had. I was glad the Holy Spirit didn't show up. I would have kind of thrown the timetable off. But so yeah, but I think that attitude toward time and the fragility of friendships within this larger under this canopy that what again Taylor's idea of the immanent frame. I think that they're very much related to this pursuit of control, and a number of people I was reading to prepare for this talked about the problem of instrumentalizing friendships. You know I lived and worked in D.C. for a long time, and there, making contacts is all about power. It's all about sustaining power. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think it's interesting to think about practices within the life of the church that can restore a recognition that that intimacy is actually well, I started to say that all intimacy is not erotic, but even the fact that eros has become associated just with sexual activity, when in fact it's not. It hasn't always been understood that way. Yeah, we had time for questions, but no time for answers. That's
There are others.
I returned to teaching high school English after some 20 years, and one of the summer reading books, I'm in an all-girls school, is A Separate Peace, which is in 1950s, and it's close, intimate,
yeah.
okay, friendships between young men. And the students I have cannot read it without reading into it
Yeah,
that it's all same-sex attraction.
yeah, yeah.
And that's the assumption. And even the afterword of the edition that we use has an interview with the author saying, no, this is not the intention of the book.
Right.
But the difficulty they have, and so even during the year when we're reading other texts or from the Iliad, fine line, and it's very difficult for them to, or trying to find a contemporary cultural example, very difficult for them to identify
Oh,
with.
yeah. How about David and
Oh, yeah,
Jonathan, or
yeah.
and Jesus, or Jesus and John? Yeah. So, and I do wonder to what extent that intuition is tied not just to the hypersexualizing of our culture, but to the fact that there's not an imagination, or again, to use Charles Taylor's term of a social imaginary, there's not a way of perceiving that an intimate relationship can be an expression of a shared commitment to the good, to make it sound too philosophical. I mean, even though the good might be, it's not being expressed philosophically in the relationship, but there, a delight in the experience of goods, which is which, yeah, again, it's it doesn't necessarily lead to sexual activity, but when sexual activity becomes the only counterfeit of transcendence, then that and a celebrated counterfeit of transcendence. So I was working on this. I was thinking of I'd never watched the TV show Friends, and I watched Seinfeld a little bit. Seinfeld, Thomas Hibbs wrote a book called Shows About Nothing, where he's talking about kind of everyday nihilism, and used Seinfeld as. I have watched some of the show Big Bang Theory. So you have a lot of these programs that show people in their 20s and 30s who have what are supposed to be paradigmatic relationships in some way. But they're remarkably innocuous because they have there's nothing transcendent that motivates them. And often there's a lot of sexual innuendo also. Because again, that is the only kind of avenue towards something that transcends the banality of their experience. There's no answer here. Sorry. But thank you for sharing that. I think that's important to realize.
Ken, I want to build off of what Sister Thomas More just said. And actually, I had a similar conversation with Father Joseph Anthony this morning about this assumption of homoeroticism.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering why that's become our paradigm. You know, if you're a Marxist, you see everything through an economics lens. If you're a feminist, everything through that kind of relationship lens.
Yeah, I think in some level, it's, again, this gets in part to my little potentially snarky comment that the only good that seems to be recognized is transgression. And so it's, and I do think that the kind of notions of sexual expression and gender identity, all of those are extensions of the idea that we create our identity, and that our instinctive or instinctual definition of ourselves is something that has a kind of sovereignty that can't be. So I do think that there is a preoccupation. I also do think that if I can't remember the phrase. There's a phrase in Jonathan Edwards where he basically says God created everything so that his son could have a bride. So I think even within the church, we've forgotten that I think marriage has an ontological priority to sexuality. And it's not that we're sexual beings who have been given the institution of marriage to govern our sexuality. We're marriageable beings who have been given the resources of sexuality to
I just wonder how we got from Puritanism to mass pornography.
Yeah, yeah. Well, yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think there is within the Puritan mind. I mean, it's not insignificant that a lot of the founders of the Royal Society were Puritans. And there is a kind of sympathy with that 17th century idea that we're going to control things. So there's a kind of, and in fact, Francis Bacon, I know particularly within the Southern Presbyterian tradition, Francis Bacon was like the 13th apostle. He was, there was such an affection for the account of rationality that was present in Bacon. So there are these seeds that are planted along the way. Also, the radical individualism, even though the Puritans definitely had a great sense of being a community. When I read George Marsden's biography of Jonathan Edwards years ago, and he talks early on about the great struggles that Edwards had about questions about assurance of salvation, there's no mention in the book that he actually talked to anyone about it. It was a struggle between him and God that he had to do. So I think there are seeds. You know, Puritanism is in significant ways a modern movement, and we can look at the moral concerns and see, well, gee, they looked awfully conservative, but there might have been metaphysical and epistemological currents underneath that gave rise to Emerson, among other things. So.
It would be interesting to follow up on that, but it's time for lunch.
Yeah.